goodness and mercy. Bugs said so long to the disappearing land, a dark blue finger of Labrador. The ship was passing through the Strait of Belle Isle on its third day out from Montreal. "Now I gotta make it to the White Cliffs of Dover," she said. She made a face, rounding her eyes and her small, adept mouth, as if she had to accept some bad nuisance. "Else it's over the side and feed the fishes." Bugs was dying, but she had been a very slender, white-skinned woman before she started that, so there wasn't a shocking difference. Her bright silver hair was cut in a clever fluffed-out bob by her daughter, Averil. Her pallor was by no means ghastly, and the loose tops and caftans that Averil had made for her concealed the state of her arms and her upper body. Occasional expressions of fatigue and distress blended in with an old expression she had, a humorous, hardened plaintiveness. She was not looking badly at all, and her coughing was under control. "That's a joke," she said to Averil, who was paying for the trip out of some money left to her by the father she had never seen to remember. When they made the arrangements, they hadn't known what was going to happen, or that it was going to happen as soon as now looked likely. "Actually, I intend to hang around making your life miserable for years to come," Bugs said. "I look better, don't you think? Anyway, in the morning, I'm eating. I was thinking I'd start taking little walks. I walked to the rail yesterday when you weren't here." They had a cabin on the boat deck, with a chair for Bugs set up outside. There was a bench under the cabin window, occupied now by Averil, and in the mornings by the University of Toronto professor whom Bugs called her admirer, or that professorial jerk. This was happening on a Norwegian passenger-carrying freighter in the late 70s in the month of July. All the way across the North Atlantic, the weather was sunny, the sea flat and bright as glass. Bug's real name, of course, was June. Her real name and her singing name was June Rogers. For the last year and 3 months, she had not sung in public. For the last 8 months, she had not gone to the conservatory to give lessons. She had a few students coming to the apartment on Huron Street in the evenings and on Saturdays, so that Averil could accompany them on the piano. Averil worked at the conservatory, in the office. She biked home for lunch every day to see if Bugs was all right. She didn't say she was doing it for that reason. She had the excuse of her special lunch: skim milk, wheat germ, and a banana mixed up in the blender. Averil was usually trying to lose weight. Bugs had sung at weddings. She had been the paid soloist with church choirs. She had sung in the Messiah and the St. Matthew Passion and in Gilbert and Sullivan. She had sung supporting roles in Toronto productions of operas with famous imported stars. For a while, in the 50s, she had shared a radio program with a popular drunken tenor who had got them both sacked. The name June Rogers had been well enough known all the time that Averil was growing up. It was well enough known at least among the people that Averil usually met. It was a surprise for Averil, more than for Bugs, to run into people who now didn't recognize it. People on the boat hadn't recognized it. About half of the 30 or so passengers were Canadians, most of them from around Toronto, but they hadn't recognized it. "My mother sang Zerlina," Averil said, during her first conversation with the professor, "in Don Giovanni, in 1964. She had been 10 at the time, and remembered the occasion as one filled with glory. Apprehension, flurry, crisis, a sore throat cured by yoga, a peasant costume with a ruffled pink and gold skirt over piles of petticoats. Glory. "Honey, Zerlina is just not a household word," Bugs said to her afterward. "Also, professors are dumb. They are dumber than ordinary. I could be nice and say they know about things we don't, but as far as I'm concerned, they don't know shit." But she let the professor sit beside her and tell her things about himself every morning. She told Averill what she'd learned. He walked the deck for an hour before breakfast. At home, he walked 6 miles a day. He had caused a certain amount of scandal at the university a few years ago by marrying his young wife. His dim-wit wife, said Bugs, whose name was Leslie. He had made enemies, stirred up envy and discontent among his colleagues with his dalliance. And then, by divorcing his wife and marrying this girl, who was 1 year younger than his oldest child. From then on, certain people were out to get him, and they did. He was a biologist, but he had devised a sort of general science course. He called it a scientific literacy course for students in the humanities. A lively, unalarming course that he hoped would be a modest breakthrough. He got the approval of the higher-ups, but the course was scuttled by members of his own department, who devised all kinds of cumbersome, silly requirements and prerequisites. He retired early. I think that was it, Bugs said. I couldn't keep my mind on it. Also, young women can make very frustrating mates for older men. Youth can be boring. Oh, yes. With an older woman, a man can relax. The rhythms of her thoughts and memories, the rhythms of her thoughts and memories will be more in harmony with his. What puke. Down the deck, the young wife, Leslie, sat working on a needlepoint cover for a dining room chair. This was the 3rd cover she had done. She needed 6 altogether. The 2 women she sat with were glad to admire her pattern. It was called Tudor Rose. And they talked about needlepoint covers that they had made. They described how these fitted in with the furnishings of their houses. Leslie sat between them, somewhat protected. She was a soft, pink-skinned, brown-haired girl whose youth was draining away. She invited kindness, but Bugs had not been very kind to her when she hauled the needlepoint out of her bag. "Oh, my," said Bugs. She threw up her hands and waggled her skinny fingers. "These hands," she said, and got the better of a fit of coughing, "these hands have done plenty of things I am not proud of, but I must say they have never picked up a knitting needle, or an embroidery needle, or a crochet hook, or even sewn on a button if there was a safety pin handy. So I'm hardly the person to appreciate, my dear." Leslie's husband laughed. Averill thought that what Bugs said was not completely true. It was Bugs who had taught her how to sew. Bugs and Averill both took a serious interest in clothes and were attentive to fashion in a playful, unintimidated way. Some of their best hours together had been spent in cutting up material, pinning it together, getting inspirations. The caftans, the loose tops that Bugs wore on the boat, were patchworks of silk and velvet and brightly patterned cotton and crocheted lace, all from old dresses and curtains and tablecloths that Averill had picked up at second-hand stores. These creations were greatly admired by Janine, an American woman on the boat, who was making friends zealously. "Where do you find these gorgeous things?" said Janine. And Bugs said, "Averill. Averill made them. Isn't she clever?" "She's a genius," said Janine. "You're a genius, Averill." "She should make theater costumes," Bugs said. "I keep telling her." "Yes, why don't you?" said Janine. Averill flushed and could not think of anything to say, anything to placate Bugs and Janine, who were smiling at her. Bugs said, "I'm just as glad she's not, though. I'm just as glad she's here. Averill is my treasure." Walking the deck, away from Bugs, Janine asked Averill, "You mind telling me how old you are?" Averill said 23, and Janine sighed. She said that she was 42. She was married, but not accompanied by her husband. She had a long, tanned face with glossy, pinkish mauve lips and shoulder-length hair thick and smooth as an oak plank. She said that people often told her she looked as if she was from California, but actually she was from Wisconsin. She was from a small city in Wisconsin, where she had been the hostess of a radio phone-in show. Her voice was low and persuasive and full of satisfaction, even if she disclosed a problem, a grief, a shame. She said, "Your mother is charming." Averill said, "People either think that or they can't stand her." "Has she been ill long?" "She's recuperating," said Averill. "She had pneumonia last spring." This was what they had agreed to say. Janine was more eager to be friends with Bugs than Bugs was to be friends with her. Nevertheless, Bugs slid into her customary half-intimacy, confiding some things about the professor and disclosing the name she had thought up for him, Dr. Faustus. His wife's name was Tudor Rose. Janine thought these names appropriate and funny. "Oh, delightful," she said. She did not know the name that Bugs had given her, Glamourpuss. Avril walked around the deck and listened to people talking. She thought about how sea voyages were supposed to be about getting away from it all, and how it all presumably meant your life, the way you lived, the person you were at home. Yet in all the conversations she overheard, people were doing just the opposite. They were establishing themselves, telling about their jobs and their children and their gardens and their dining rooms. Recipes were offered for fruitcake and compost heaps. Also, ways of dealing with daughters-in-law and investments. Tales of illness, betrayal, real estate. I said, "I did. I always believe. Well, I don't know about you, but I..." Avril, walking past with her face turned toward the sea, wondered how you got to do this. How did you learn to be so stubborn and insistent and to claim your turn? "I did it all over last fall in Blue and Oyster. I'm afraid I have never been able to see the charms of opera." That last was the professor, imagining that he could put Bugs in her place. And why did he say he was afraid? Avril didn't get to walk alone for very long. She had her own admirer, who would stalk and cut her off at the rail. He was an artist, a Canadian artist from Montreal, who sat across from her in the dining room. When he was asked at the first meal what kind of pictures he painted, he had said that his latest work was a figure 9 feet high, entirely wrapped in bandages, which bore quotations from the American Declaration of Independence. "How interesting," said some polite Americans, and the artist said with a tight sneer, "I'm glad you think so." "But why," said Janine, with her interviewer's adroit response to hostility, a special rich kindness in the voice, a more alert and interested smile. "Why did you not use Canadian quotations of some sort?" "Yes, I was wondering that too," said Avril. Sometimes she tried to get into conversations this way. She tried to echo or expand the things that other people said. Usually it did not work well. Canadian quotations turned out to be a sore subject with the artist. Critics had taken him to task for that very thing, accusing him of insufficient nationalism, missing the very point that he was trying to make. He ignored Janine, but followed Avril from the table and harangued her for what seemed like hours, developing a ferocious crush on her as he did so. Next morning, he was waiting to go into breakfast with her, and afterward he asked her if she had ever done any modeling. "Me," said Avril. "I'm way too fat." He said he didn't mean with clothes on. If he had been another sort of artist, he said, she gathered that the other sort was the sort he despised, he would have picked her out immediately as a model. Her big golden thighs. She was wearing shorts, which she didn't put on again. Her long hair like caramelized sugar, her square shoulders and unindented waist. A goddess figure, goddess coloring, goddess of the harvest. He said she had a pure and childish scowl. Avril thought that she must remember to keep smiling. He was a stocky, swarthy, irritable-looking man. Bugs named him Toulouse-Lautrec. Men had fallen in love with Avril before. Twice she had promised to marry them, then had had to get out of it. She had slept with the one she was engaged to and with 2 or 3 others. Actually, 4 others. She had had 1 abortion. She was not frigid. She did not think so, but there was something about her participation in sex that was polite and appalled, and it was always a relief when they let go of her. She dealt with the artist by granting him a conversation early in the day when she felt strong and almost light-hearted. She didn't sit down with him. and during the afternoon and evening she kept him at arm's length. Part of her strategy was to take up with Janine. That was all right, as long as Janine talked about her own life and didn't move in on Averil's. "Your mother is a gallant woman and very charming," Janine said. "But charming people can be very manipulative. You live with her, don't you?" Averil said yes, and Janine said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I hope I'm not being too intrusive. I hope I haven't offended you." Averil was really only puzzled in a familiar way. Why did people so quickly take for granted that she was stupid? "You know, I've gotten so used to interviewing people," Janine said. "I'm actually quite bad at ordinary conversation. I've forgotten how to communicate in a non-professional situation. I'm too blunt and I'm too interested. I need help with that." The whole point about coming on this trip, she said, was to get herself back to normal reality and find out who she really was when not blatting away into a microphone. And to find out who she was outside of her marriage. It was an agreement between her husband and herself, she said, that every so often they would take these little trips away from each other. They would test the boundaries of the relationship. Averil could hear what Bugs would have to say about that. "Test the boundaries of the relationship," Bugs would say. "She means get laid aboard ship." Janine said that she did not rule out a shipboard romance. That is, before she had a look at the available men, she had not ruled it out. Once she got a look, she resigned herself. Who could it be? The artist was short and ugly and anti-American. That in itself wouldn't have been entirely off-putting, but he was infatuated with Averil. The professor had a wife on board. Janine was not going to scramble around copulating in linen closets. Also, he was long-winded, had little grainy warts on his eyelids, and was taken up with Bugs. All the other men were out for one reason or another. They had wives with them, or they were too old to please her, or too young for her to please them, or they were chiefly interested in each other, or in members of the crew. She would have to use the time to give her skin a good overhaul and read a book all the way through. "Who would you pick, though?" she said to Averil, "if you were picking for me?" "What about the captain?" said Averil. "Brilliant," said Janine. "A long shot, but brilliant." She found out that the captain's age was okay. He was 54. He was married, but his wife was back in Bergen. He had 3 children grown up or nearly. He himself was not a Norwegian, but a Scot, born in Edinburgh. He had gone to sea at 16 and had captained this freighter for 10 years. Janine discovered all this by asking him. She told him she was going to do an article for a magazine on passenger-carrying freighters. She might really do this. He gave her a tour of the ship and included his own cabin. She thought that a good sign. His cabin was spick and span. There was a photograph of a large, pleasant-looking woman wearing a thick sweater. The book he was reading was by John le Carré. "He won't give her a tumble," Bugs said. "He's too canny for her. A canny Scot." Averil had not thought twice about revealing Janine's confidences, if they were confidences. She was used to bringing home all information, all enlivening tidbits, home to the apartment on Huron Street, to the cabin on the boat deck, to Bugs. All stirred into the busy pot. Bugs herself was a marvel at egging people on. She got extravagant, tangled revelations from unlikely sources. So far as Averil knew, she had not kept anything a secret. Bugs said that Janine was a type she had seen before. Glitz on the surface and catastrophe underneath. A mistake to get too chummy with her, she told Averil, but she remained fairly chummy herself. She told Janine stories that Averil had heard before. She told about Averil's father, whom she did not describe as a jerk or an admirer, but as a cautious old bugger. Old to her way of thinking, in his 40s. He was a doctor in New York. Bugs was living there. She was a young singer trying to get her start. She went to him for a sore throats being the bugbear of her life. "Aye, ear, nose, and throat man," Bugs said. How was I to know he wouldn't stop there? He had a family, of course. He came to Toronto once, to a medical conference. He saw Averil. She was standing up in her crib, and when she saw him, she howled like a banshee. I said to him, "Do you think she's got my voice?" But he was not in the mood for jokes. She scared him off. Such a cautious old bugger. I think he only slipped up the once. "I've always used bad language," Bugs said. "I like it. I liked it long before it got to be so popular. When Averil had just started to school, teacher phoned and asked me to come in for a talk. She said she was concerned about some words that Averil was using. When Averil broke her pencil or anything, she said, 'Oh, shit,' or maybe, 'Oh, fuck.' She said whatever she was used to hearing me say at home. I never warned her. I just thought she'd realize. And how could she? Poor Averil. I was a rotten mother. And that's not the worst part. Do you think I owned up to that teacher and said she got it from me? Indeed not. I behaved like a lady. Oh, dear. Oh, I do appreciate you telling me. Oh, dear. I'm an awful person. Averil always knew it. Didn't you, Averil?" Averil said yes. On the fourth day, Bugs stopped going down to the dining room for dinner. "I notice I'm getting a bit gray around the gills by that time," she said. "I don't want to turn the professor off. He may not be so stuck on older women as he lets on." She said she ate enough at breakfast and lunch. Breakfast was always my best meal, and here I eat a huge breakfast. Averil came back from dinner with rolls and fruit. "Lovely," said Bugs. "Later." She had to sleep propped up. "Maybe the nurse has oxygen," Averil said. There was no doctor on the ship, but there was a nurse. Bugs did not want to see her. She did not want oxygen. "These are not bad," she said of her coughing fits. "They're not as bad as they sound. Just little spasms. I've been figuring out what they are punishment for, seeing I never smoked. I thought maybe singing in church and not believing, but no, I think sound of music. Maria, God hates it." Averil and Janine played poker in the evenings with the artist and the Norwegian first mate. Averil always went back to the boat deck a few times to check on Bugs. Bugs would be asleep or pretending to be asleep, the fruit and buns by her bed untouched. Averil pulled out of the game early. She did not go to bed immediately, though she had made a great point of being so sleepy that she could not keep her eyes open. She slipped into the cabin to retrieve the uneaten buns, then went out on the deck. She sat on the bench beneath the window. The window was always wide open on the warm, still night. Averil sat there and ate the buns as quietly as she could, biting with care through the crisp, delicious crust. The sea air made her just as hungry as it was supposed to do. Or else it was having somebody in love with her, the tension. Under those circumstances, she usually gained weight. She could listen to Bugs' breathing, little flurries and halts, ragged accelerations, some snags, snores, and achieved straight runs. She could hear Bugs half wake and shift and struggle and prop herself up in bed. And she could watch the captain when he came out for his walk. She didn't know if he saw her. He never indicated. He never looked her way. He looked straight ahead. He was getting his exercise at night, when there would be the least chance of having to be sociable. Back and forth, close to the rail. Averil stayed still. She felt like a fox in the brush, a night animal watching him. But she didn't think he would be startled if she should move or call out. He was alert to everything on the ship, surely. He knew she was there, but could ignore her out of courtesy, or his own sense of confidence. She thought of Janine's designs on him, and agreed with Bugs that they were doomed to failure. The captain did not seem to her a needy man. He did not need to disturb you or falter or provoke or waylay you. None of that, look at me, listen to me, admire me, give me. None of that. He had other things on his mind. The ship, the sea, the weather, the cargo, his crew, his commitments. The passengers must be an old story to him. Cargo of another sort, requiring another sort of attention. Idle or ailing, lustful or grieving, curious, impatient, mischievous, remote. He would have seen them all before. He would know things about them right away, but never more than he needed to know. He would know about Janine. An old story. How did he decide when to go in? Did he time himself? Did he count his steps? He was gray-haired and straight-backed, with a thickness of body around the waist and the stomach, speaking not of indulgence, but of a peaceable authority. Bugs had not thought up any name for him. She had called him a canny Scot, but beyond that she had taken no interest. There were no little tags about him for Bugs to get hold of, no inviting bits of showing off, no glittery layers ready to flake away. He was a man made long ago, not making himself moment by moment, and using whomever he could find in the process. One night, before the captain appeared, Averil heard singing. She heard Bugs singing. She heard Bugs wake and resettle herself and start singing. Sometimes, in the last months, Bugs had sung a phrase during a lesson. She had sung under her breath, with great caution, and out of necessity to demonstrate something. She did not sing like that now. She sang lightly, as she used to do in practice, saving her strength for the performance. But she sang truly and adequately, with unimpaired or almost unimpaired sweetness. Vedre Carino, Bugs sang, just as she used to sing when setting the table or looking out the rainy window of the apartment, making a light sketch that could be richly filled in if she chose. She might have been waiting for somebody at those times, or wooing an improbable happiness, or just limbering up for a concert. Vedrai carino, se si bonina, che by remedio ti voglio dar. Averil's head had pulled up when the singing started. Her body had tightened as at a crisis. But there was no call for her. She stayed where she was. After the first moment's alarm, she felt just the same thing she always felt when her mother sang. The doors flew open, effortlessly. There was the lighted space beyond, a revelation of kindness and seriousness, desirable, blessed joy and seriousness, a play of kindness that asked nothing of you, nothing but to set out this bright order. It altered everything. And then, the moment Bugs stopped singing, it was gone. Gone. It seemed that Bugs herself had taken it away. Bugs could imply that it was just a trick, nothing more. She could imply that you were a bit of a fool to take such notice of it. It was a gift that Bugs was obliged to offer to everybody. There. That's all. You're welcome. Nothing special. Bugs had that secret, which she openly displayed, then absolutely protected, from Averil just as from everybody else. Averil is not particularly musical, thank God, was what Bugs had often said. The captain came on deck just as Bugs finished singing. He might have caught the tail end of it, or been waiting decently in the shadows until it was over. He walked, and Averil watched, as usual. Averil could sing in her head, but even in her head she never sang the songs that she associated with Bugs. None of Zerlina's songs or the soprano parts of the oratorios, not even Farewell to Nova Scotia or any of the folk songs that Bugs mocked for their sappy sentiments, though she sang them angelically. Averil had a hymn that she sang. She hardly knew where it came from. She couldn't have learned it from Bugs. Bugs disliked hymns, generally speaking. Averil must have picked it up at church when she was a child and had to go along with Bugs when Bugs was doing a solo. It was the hymn that starts out, "The Lord's my shepherd." Averil did not know that it came from a psalm. She had not been to church often enough to know about psalms. She did know all the words in the hymn, which she had to admit were full of strenuous egotism and straightforward triumph, and particularly in one verse a childish sort of gloating. "My table thou hast furnished in presence of my foes." How blithely and securely and irrationally Averil's head voice sang these words, while she watched the captain pace in front of her, and later, when she herself walked safely down to the rail. "Goodness and mercy all my life shall surely follow me, and in God's house forevermore my dwelling place shall be." Her silent singing wrapped around the story she was telling herself, which she extended further every night on the deck. Averil often told herself stories. The activity seemed to her as unavoidable as dreaming. Her singing was a barrier set between the world in her head and the world outside, between her body and the onslaught of the stars, the black mirror of the North Atlantic. Bugs stopped going down to lunch. She still went to breakfast and was lively then, and for an hour or so afterward. She said she didn't feel any worse. She was just tired of listening and talking. She didn't sing again, at least not when Averil could hear her. On the 9th night, which was the last night out before they were to dock at Tilbury, Janine gave a party in her cabin. Janine had the largest and best cabin on the boat deck. She provided champagne, which she had brought on board for this purpose, and whiskey and wine, along with caviar, grapes, heaps of smoked salmon, and steak tartare and cheese and flatbread from the unsuspected resources of the kitchen. "I'm squandering," she said. "I'm flying high. I'll be wandering around Europe with a knapsack on my back stealing eggs out of hen houses. I don't care. I'll take all your addresses, and when I'm utterly broke, I'll come and stay with you. Don't laugh." Bugs had meant to go to the party. She had stayed in bed all day, not even going to breakfast, in order to save her strength. She got up and washed, then propped herself back against the pillows to do her makeup. She did it beautifully, eyes and all. She brushed out and teased and sprayed her hair. She put on her grand soloist's dress, which Averil had made, an almost straight-cut but ample long dress of dark purple silk, its wide sleeves lined with more silk of iridescent pink and silver. "Aubergine," said Bugs. She turned to make the dress flare out at the hem. The turn made her unsteady, and she had to sit down. "I should do my nails," she said. "I'll wait a little, though. I'm too jittery." "I could do them," Averil said. She was pinning up her hair. "Could you? But I don't think I'll go, after all. I think I'd rather just stay right here and rest. Tomorrow I have to be in good shape. Landing." Averil helped her take off the dress and wash her face and put her nightgown back on. She helped her into bed. "It's a crime about the dress," Bugs said. "Not to go. It deserves to get out. You should wear it. You wear it, please." Averil did not think that purple suited her, but she ended up discarding her own green dress and putting on Bugs. She went down the hall to the party, feeling strange, defiant, and absurd. It was all right. Everybody had dressed up, some to a remarkable extent. Even the men had decked themselves out somehow. The artist wore an old tuxedo jacket with his jeans, and the professor appeared in a white suit of rather floppy cut, looking like a plantation dandy. Janine's dress was black and skimpy, worn with seamed black stockings and big chunks of gold jewelry. Leslie was swathed in taffeta, with red and pink roses on a creamy ground. Over her curvy bum the material was bunched out in one huge rose, whose petals the professor kept patting and tweaking and arranging to best advantage. It would seem that he was newly entranced with her. She was relieved and proud, shyly blooming. "Your mother is not coming to the party," said the professor to Averil. "Parties bore her," Averil said. "I get the impression that many things bore her," the professor said. "I have noticed that with performing artists, and it is understandable. They have to concentrate so much on themselves." "Who is this, the Statue of Liberty?" said the artist, brushing the silk of Averil's dress. "Is there a woman inside there at all?" Averil had heard that he had been discussing her with Janine lately, wondering if she was possibly a lesbian, and Bugs was not her mother but her rich and jealous lover. "Is there a woman or a hunk of concrete?" he said, molding the silk to her hip. Averil didn't care. This was the last night that she would have to see him, and she was drinking. She liked to drink. She liked especially to drink champagne. It made her feel not excited, but blurry and forgiving. She talked to the first mate, who was engaged to a girl from the mountains, and showed an agreeable lack of love interest in herself. She talked to the cook, a handsome woman who had formerly taught English in Norwegian high schools and was now intent on a more adventurous life. Janine had told Averil that the cook and the artist were believed to be sleeping together, and a certain challenging, ironic edge to the cook's friendliness made Averil think that this might be true. She talked to Leslie, who said that she had once been a harpist. She had been a young harpist playing dinner music in a hotel, and the professor had spotted her behind the ferns. She had not been a student, as people thought. It was after they became involved that the professor had her enroll in some courses to develop her mind. She giggled over her champagne and said that it had not worked. She had resisted mind development, but had given up the harp. Janine spoke to Averil in a voice as low and confidential as she could make it. "How will you manage with her?" she said. "What will you do in England? How can you take her on a train? This is serious." "Don't worry," Averil said. "I have not been open with you," said Janine. "I have to go to the bathroom, but I want to tell you something when I come out." Averil hoped that Janine did not intend to make more disclosures about the artist, or to give more advice about Bugs. She didn't. When she came out of the bathroom, she began to talk about herself. She said that she was not on a little vacation, as she had claimed. She had been turfed out by her husband, who had left her for a sexpot Moran who worked as a receptionist at the station. Being a receptionist involved doing her nails and occasionally answering the telephone. The husband considered that he and Janine should still be friends, and he would come to visit, helping himself to the wine and describing the pretty ways of his paramour, how she sat up in bed, naked, doing, what else, her fingernails. He wanted Janine to laugh with him and commiserate with him over his ill-judged and besotted love. And she did. Janine did. Time and again she fell in with what he wanted and listened to his tales and watched her wine disappear. He said he loved her, Janine, as if she were the sister he'd never had. But now Janine meant to pull him out of her life by the roots. She was up and away. She meant to live. She still had her eye on the captain, though it was the 11th hour. He had turned down champagne and was drinking whiskey. The cook had brought up a coffee tray for those who did not drink or who wished to sober up early. When somebody finally tried a cup, the cream proved to be on the turn, probably from sitting for a while in the warm room. Unflustered, the cook took it away, promising to bring back fresh. "It will be good on the pancakes in the morning," she said, "with brown sugar on the pancakes." Janine said that somebody had told her once that when the milk was sour, you could suspect that there was a dead body on the ship. "I thought it was a kind of superstition," Janine said. But he said, "No, there's a reason. The ice. They've used all the ice to keep the body, so the milk goes sour." He said he had known it to happen on a ship in the tropics. The captain was asked laughingly if there was any such problem on board this ship. He said not that he knew of, no. "And we have plenty of refrigeration," he said. "Anyway, you bury them at sea, don't you?" said Janine. "You can marry or bury at sea, can't you? Or do you really refrigerate them and send them home?" "We do as the case dictates," said the captain. But had it happened with him, he was asked? Were their bodies kept? Had there been burials at sea? A young chap once, one of the crew, died of appendicitis. He hadn't any family we knew of. We buried him at sea. That's a funny expression when you think of it, said Leslie, who was giggling at everything. Buried at sea. Another time, said the captain, another time it was a lady. Then he told Janine and Averill and a few others who were standing around a story. Not Leslie. Her husband took her away. One time on this ship, the captain said, there were two sisters traveling together. This was on a different run a few years ago in the South Atlantic. The sisters looked 20 years apart in age, but that was only because one of them was very sick. She might not have been so much the elder. Perhaps she was not the elder at all. Probably they were both in their 30s. Neither one was married. The one who was not sick was very beautiful. The most beautiful woman I have ever seen in my life, said the captain, speaking solemnly as if describing a view or a building. She was very beautiful, but she did not pay attention to anybody except her sister, who was laid up in the cabin with what was probably a heart condition. The other one used to go out at night and sit on the bench outside the window of their cabin. She might walk to the rail and back, but she never stirred far from the window. The captain supposed that she was staying within hearing distance in case her sister needed her. He could see her sitting there when he went out for his late-night walk, but he pretended not to see her, because it seemed to him she didn't want to be seen, or to have to say hello. But there was a night when he was walking past, and he heard her call to him. She called so softly he barely heard her. He went over to the bench, and she said, "Captain, I'm sorry. My sister has just died. I'm sorry. My sister has just died." She led him into the cabin, and she was absolutely right. Her sister was lying on the bed next to the door. Her eyes were half open. She had just died. Things were in a bit of a mess, the way they sometimes are on such occasions, the captain said. And by the way she reacted to that, I knew she hadn't been in the cabin when it happened. She'd been outside. Neither the captain nor the woman said a word. They set to work together to get things cleaned up, and they washed the body off and straightened it out and closed the eyes. When they were finished, the captain asked whom he should notify. "Nobody," the woman said. "Nobody. There is nobody but the two of us," she said. "Then will you have the body buried at sea?" the captain asked her, and she said yes. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow morning." And she said, "Why do we have to wait? Couldn't we do it now?" Of course that was a good idea, though the captain wouldn't have urged it on her himself. The less the other passengers and even the crew have to be aware of a death on board, the better. And it was hot weather, summer in the South Atlantic. They wrapped the body up in one of the sheets, and between them they put it out through the window, which was wide open for air. The dead sister was light, wasted. They carried her to the rail. Then the captain said that he would just go and get some rope and tie the body up in the sheet so that it wouldn't fall out when they dropped it over. "Couldn't we use scarves?" she said, and she ran back to the cabin and came out with an assortment of scarves and sashes, very pretty stuff. He bound the body up in the sheet with those and said that he would now go and get his book to read the service for the dead. The woman laughed and said, "What good is your book to you here? It's too dark to read." He saw that she dreaded being left alone with the body. She was right, too, about its being too dark to read. He could have got a flashlight. He didn't know whether he had even thought of that. He really did not want to leave her. He did not like the state she was in. He asked her what he should say then. "Some prayers?" "Say whatever you like," she said. And he said the Lord's Prayer. He did not recall if she joined in. Then something like, "Lord Jesus Christ, in thy name we commit this woman to the deep. Have mercy on her soul." Something like that. They picked up the body and rolled it over the rail. It hardly made a splash. She asked if that was all, and he told her yes. He would just have to fill out some papers and make up the death certificate. "What did she die of?" he asked. "Was it a heart attack?" He wondered what kind of spell he had been under not to have asked that before. "Oh," she said, "I killed her." "I knew it," Janine cried. "I knew it was murder." The captain walked the woman back to the bench under the window of the cabin, all lit up now like Christmas, and asked her what she meant. She said she had been sitting here where she was now, and she heard her sister call. She knew her sister was in trouble. She knew what it was. Her sister needed an injection. She never moved. She tried to move. That is, she kept thinking of moving. She saw herself going into the cabin and getting out the needle. She saw herself doing that, but she wasn't moving. She strained herself to do it, but she didn't. She sat like stone. She could no more move than you can move out of some danger's way in a dream. She sat and listened until she knew that her sister was dead. Then the captain came, and she called to him. The captain told her that she had not killed her sister. Wouldn't her sister have died anyway, he said. Wouldn't she have died very soon? If not tonight, very soon? Oh, yes, she said. Probably. Not probably, the captain said. Certainly. Not probably. Certainly. He would put heart attack on the death certificate, and that would be all there was to it. So now you must calm down, he said. Now you know it will be all right. He pronounced calm in the Scottish way, to rhyme with lamb. Yes, the woman said. She knew that part of it would be all right. I'm not sorry, she said. But I think you have to remember what you have done. Then she went over to the rail, the captain said, and of course I went along with her because I couldn't be sure what she meant to do. And she sang a hymn. That was all. I guess it was her contribution to the service. She sang so you could hardly hear her, but the hymn was one I knew. I can't recall it, but I knew it perfectly well. Goodness and mercy all my life, Averil sang then, lightly but surely, so that Janine squeezed her around the waist and exclaimed, "Well, Champagne Sally!" The captain showed a moment's surprise. Then he said, "I believe that may have been it." He might have been relinquishing something, a corner of his story, to Averil. That may have been it. Averil said, "That's the only hymn I know." "But is that all?" Janine said. "There wasn't any family fortune involved, or they weren't both in love with the same man?" "No?" "Well, I guess it wasn't TV." The captain said no, it wasn't TV. Averil believed that she knew the rest of it. How could she help knowing? It was her story. After the woman sang the hymn, the captain took her hand off the rail. He held her hand to his mouth and kissed it. He kissed the back of it. Then, the palm to rhyme with lamb. Her hand that had lately done its service to the dead. In some versions of the story, that was all he did. That was enough. In other versions, he was not so easily satisfied, nor was she. She went with him inside, along the corridor into the lighted cabin, and there he made love to her on the very bed that, according to him, they had just stripped and cleaned, sending its occupant and one of its sheets to the bottom of the ocean. They landed on that bed because they couldn't wait to get to the other bed under the window. They couldn't wait to hurtle into the lovemaking that they kept up till daybreak and that would have to last them the rest of their lives. Sometimes they turned the light off. Sometimes they didn't care. The captain had told it as if the mother and daughter were sisters, and he had transported the boat to the South Atlantic, and he had left off the finale, as well as supplying various details of his own. But Averil believed that it was her story he had told. It was the story that she had been telling herself night after night on the deck, her perfectly secret story, delivered back to her. She had made it, and she had to believe now that he had taken it and told it. Believing that such a thing could happen made her feel weightless and distinct and glowing, like a fish lit up in the water. Bugs did not die that night. She died 2 weeks later in the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh. She had managed to get that far on the train. Averil was not with her when she died. She was a couple of blocks away, eating a baked potato from a takeout shop. Bugs made one of her last coherent remarks about the Royal Infirmary. She said, "Doesn't it sound old world?" Averil, coming out to eat after having been in the hospital room all day, had been surprised to find that there was still so much light in the sky, and that so many lively, brightly dressed people were in the streets, speaking French and German, and probably lots of other languages that she couldn't recognize. Every year at this time, the captain's hometown held a festival. Averil brought Bug's body home on a plane to a funeral with fine music in Toronto. She found herself sitting beside another Canadian returning from Scotland, a young man who had played in a famous amateur golf tournament and had not done as well as he had expected. Failure and loss made these two kind to each other, and they were easily charmed by the other's ignorance of the world of sport and of music. Since he lived in Toronto, it was easy for the young man to show up at the funeral. In a short time, he and Averil were married. After a while, they were less kind and less charmed, and Averil began to think that she had chosen her husband chiefly because Bugs would have thought the choice preposterous. They were divorced. But Averil met another man, a good deal older than herself, a high school drama teacher and play director. His talent was more reliable than his goodwill. He had an offhand, unsettlingly flippant and ironical manner. He either charmed people or aroused their considerable dislike. He had tried to keep himself free of entanglements. Averil's pregnancy, however, persuaded them to marry. Both of them hoped for a daughter. Averil never saw again or heard from any of the people who were on the boat. But on that last night, Averil accepts the captain's offering. She is absolved and fortunate. She glides like the spangled fish inside her dark silk dress. She and the captain bid each other good night. They touch hands ceremoniously. The skin of their hands is flickering in the touch.